Tom Campbell is a physicist, and he wrote a book called My Big Toe. And My Big Toe is my theory of everything, is the toe. My Big Toe, my theory of everything. And it's a pretty popular book. It's an interesting book, and he describes a way of understanding reality and understanding your true nature. So if you're interested, you know, it's a good resource. You can look him up on YouTube, and you can get the book on Amazon. But I wanted to talk about emotions because emotions are energy, right? Energy and motion, right? And energy and emotions are the source of a lot of human suffering, is it not true? You know, emotions are the source of a lot of human suffering. People are suffering from anxiety, you know, which is fear, you know. People are suffering from fear, suffering from depression, suffering from anger, right? A lot of what doesn't work in the world, a lot of the terrible things that you hear about in the world are a function of people's being run by their emotions, right? So I was looking at this, and one of the things that occurred to me about it is that you can actually use working with emotions as a way of waking up. You can use working with emotions as a way of waking up. For example, instead of, you know, most people, the relationship with fear, right, the personality is an emotionally disturbed being. The personality is an emotionally disturbed being. The personality is afraid all the time, right? The conditioning that you have and the idea that you have of who you are leaves you in a circumstance in which fear is understandable, right? Because if you're separate from the world, right, and you believe you're your body, right, so right away if you believe you're your body, you're afraid of getting hurt, right? But then you believe you're your personality, you're afraid of getting hurt emotionally, right? And then you're in the world and you're afraid of, you know, all the possibilities that are out there that can be threatening, right? So to be afraid as a personality is actually realistic. It's actually realistic. The good news is that self-realization means that you're not that, and when you wake up from being that, the fear and the anger and the depression and the moods and all that starts to become possible for that to leave you. You know, so you can, that's what they talk about, liberation, right? Liberation, freedom from what? Suffering. What kind of suffering? Emotional suffering, right? There's a lot of different forms of suffering, but emotional suffering is a pretty significant form of suffering for human beings. I mean, I'm a psychologist, and people, when people come to me, it's because they're suffering emotionally, you know. So how can you use your emotional experience as a kind of a method to wake up? Well, you can. For example, most people, when you're in the mode of being a personality and fear is there, you're afraid. Now, just look at what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that fear occurs in your awareness, right? Now I'm saying you're afraid. Do you get the difference? You're actually identified with the fear. You're being afraid. You are being afraid. You're being the fear, right? If you're angry, you know, it's not that anger has arisen in your awareness. No, you're being angry, right? So the anger is actually manifesting itself as you. It's manifesting itself as you. The fear is manifesting itself as you. And the thing about this, for example, anxiety is a very common experience for people today, right? So, but when people are suffering from anxiety, right, they're being anxious, right? Or when anxiety occurs, the way it occurs for them is that it's something that's unwanted, it's something that I don't like, it's something that I want to control, right? And so the way you relate to it is you resist it, right? Or you try and control it, or you try and take medication to stop it from happening, right? So you can actually use emotions as a way of waking up. How? By when fear is there, right? See if you can remember to be the awareness of the fear rather than being afraid. You see the difference? Be the awareness of the fear instead of being afraid. If you're being the awareness of the fear and you're looking at the fear from the viewpoint of awareness, right? Then you can look at it in terms of what is this experience of fear? What is this experience of fear? Oh, the experience of fear has two parts to it, right? Thoughts, fearful thoughts, right? Scary thoughts, right? Thoughts about what you're afraid of, and then the sensations of fear in the physical body. That's what fear is, when there's fear, right? So when you're being the awareness of fear, right? Now watch. If you're being the awareness of fear, you're not afraid, you're the awareness looking at the fear. This is different, right? So if you're the awareness looking at the fear, now, okay, fear is occurring in the physical body. There are fearful thoughts. I am aware of the fear. I am the awareness of the fear. I'm looking at the fear. And if I'm looking at the fear, and I'm not resisting it, I'm not trying to control it, right? I'm allowed, remember one of the ways that we are when we are our natural self, when we're being who we really are, is there's no resistance. You're allowing everything to be the way it is all the time, right? So when emotions occur, you're not resisting the emotion. You're aware, you're being the awareness of the emotion, right? And when the emotion occurs, if it's a feeling, right? If it's fear, you're feeling the fear and you're being aware of the fear, but you're not afraid. You get the distinction? You're not being afraid, right? And if you can practice this, right? It takes practice. But if you can practice this, you'll start to discover when you're being the awareness of the fear that the fear dissipates. It goes. If you're being the awareness, if you're in a mood, right? If you're in a mood, right? But instead of being in the mood, you're aware of the mood, you see? Instead of being in the mood, you're aware of the mood. So when you're aware of the mood, you notice the mood, and you're looking at the mood, and the mood dissipates. The same thing is true with any emotion. When you shift from being angry to being aware of anger, and being aware of the anger as it manifests itself in your body and as it manifests itself in angry thoughts, but you're now looking at it, you're not being it. When you make that shift and you look at it, the anger starts to dissipate because you're not acting it out. You're not engaging with it. You're not identified with it, right? You ever notice if you're angry and you have angry thoughts, right? And you actually have angry thoughts about angry thoughts, right? This is identifying with the emotion, right? So no matter what the emotion is, right? Depression, the same thing is true with depression. What is depression? You know, depression is this sense of low energy, this sense of hopelessness, this sense of futility, right? This sense that everything is screwed, right? And nothing's ever going to get any better, right? When somebody's depressed, part of the depression, when they're identified with it, is that they're stuck in it. They're stuck in it. I was working with a client that is chronically depressed, and I was asking this person to be aware of the depression rather than being depressed, to be aware of the depression. How does the depression manifest itself? It manifests itself in hopeless thinking, right? So to be aware of hopeless thinking, right? But don't engage with it, right? Now it's interesting because when I was working with this particular client, right, and I was asking him to do that, you know, while we were there, to look at the depression, he would say, oh, well, but this happened, and that means that things are never going to work out. You see, he started to give a mouth to the thoughts. And I said, don't do that. Don't tell me about it, you know. Just be aware of these negative thoughts that are occurring in your mind, right? And not only be aware of the negative thoughts occurring in your mind, but don't identify with the thinking process. In other words, you're not thinking the thoughts are just happening in your mind, right? If you can be the awareness of the thoughts happening in your mind, now this takes practice. I'm not saying you could just do it like that, right? But if you can be aware of the thoughts happening in your mind and be aware of the emotions, instead of identifying with them, instead of engaging with them, right, then they will pass. So people want to get rid of fear. People don't want to be afraid, right? So one way to deal with that is to start paying attention when fear arises and see if when it arises, instead of identifying with, instead of being afraid, right, just look at it. Just look at what's here. The fear is here. Okay, the fear is here. Let it be here. It is just energy in motion. It's energy in motion, right? So you just allow it to be here, right? Now, one of the things that is involved, when I was listening to the thing that brought this up for me, I was listening to Tom Campbell answering a question that somebody asked him in a retreat about how do you deal with fear, right? So one of the things he said was consistent with what I just explained, right? Just be aware of it when it occurs, and when it occurs, just be present to it. Don't identify, don't be afraid, just be aware of fear occurring there. Don't try and control it. Experience it as a feeling, right? Experience the fear, but don't be afraid. There's a distinction there. I don't know if you can get it, right? You're not being afraid, you're experiencing the fear, right? But you're not being the fear, you're not being afraid, right? The other thing that Tom said, that he said, it takes courage to be present to fear, right? Because most people are afraid of being afraid, right? So it takes courage to be present to the fear. So I looked the word courage up because I just never had looked it up. I wanted to get the definition. It's a willingness to be with something uncomfortable is courage. The willingness to be with something uncomfortable. So fear comes up. I remember in times when I've been meditating in the past, if you're serious about meditation and you do it consistently, the time will come when you're meditating and fear will come up. While you're sitting there, fear will come up, right? And if it comes up and you understand how to meditate and you've been practicing correctly, when it comes up, you breathe, and you be with it and you feel it. You don't try and stop it. You don't try and control it. You just breathe and you be there with it as the awareness of the emotion, as the awareness of the emotion. Now that takes courage, because when you're afraid, you want to run. When you feel afraid, you want to stop the fear, right? Like that. So this is something that takes practice, but if you understand, this is what transformational possibility is. It's a transformational possibility. You can transform the disturbing, upsetting experience of the fear, right, to an experience of yourself as awareness. And that's a way to deal with the fear, If you keep practicing this, right, and you keep dealing with the fear when it arises this way, there'll be less and less fear arising, until fear is something that comes up doesn't come up much at all. The idea isn't to get rid of fear, because first of all, fear is not the enemy, right? Your fear means well. It means well. Your fear is trying to protect you, isn't it? Yeah. So to be afraid, even though you're not the body, that doesn't mean that you're not going to identify with the body in terms of it's the vehicle with which you're in the world, right? So to be afraid of something happening to you physically there's nothing wrong with that. That makes perfect sense, to be afraid of something happening to you physically. So that kind of fear you're not trying to control, you're not trying to get rid of, yeah? You're honoring it. You're honoring it. So fear is not the enemy, but when you're afraid, when your fear is a function of a misunderstanding about who you are, when your fear is neurotic fear, right? Most fear is neurotic fear. Most anxiety is neurotic anxiety, right? You're afraid, but there's nothing to be afraid of, right? The personality ends up just generally being afraid, right? And not only that, but fear is behind all the other emotions, right? Whenever you're upset, fear is at the heart of it. You're afraid first and then you're angry, right? You're afraid first and then you're angry. You're afraid because somebody might hurt you, and then you get angry because somebody was trying to hurt me. You see what I'm saying? So if you deal with fear, it's the most fundamental emotional experience that the personality has. So if you deal with fear and you pay attention to fear, you can actually use emotions as a way of realizing your true nature. Does that make sense? But you have to practice it, and it's not easy to practice because the conditioned reality of being a personality is when strong emotions come on, right? You go unconscious. When strong emotions come on, like when anger, you ever notice when strong anger comes on, right? It's like it takes over. You go unconscious, you become the anger, right? If strong fear comes on, you go unconscious, you become fearful, you become the fear, and you start acting fearfully, okay? So it's not easy to break out of that conditioning, right? But it's possible to break out of that conditioning. But the only way you're going to do it is you have to remember when the emotions arise, as soon as you become aware of the emotion, right, instead of identifying with it, pay attention to it as the awareness. Now, this is the whole business of self-realization, is you're moving out of identifying with being a personality to being aware of being a personality. You're still a personality, right? But the personality that you are now is a manifestation of awareness that was necessary for you to function in the world, okay? But when you think that you're only a personality, it sets up a condition where there's going to be a lot of suffering. Right? So the practice of realizing that you are the awareness of the personality, not the personality. When you're practicing meditation, that's exactly what you're practicing, right? Awareness of the body breathing, right? Awareness of the body breathing, not thinking about the body breathing, not thinking about meditation, awareness of the body breathing. And as you practice being aware of the body breathing, that practice wants to extend itself to become aware of the person, become aware of the personality, become aware of emotions, become aware of behaviors, become aware when there's conflict occurring, and practice not being the personality. This is not an easy thing to do, right? But it is psychotherapeutic. If you're in psychotherapy, that's what the therapist is helping you do, right? To stop being an asshole. Stop acting out your emotions. Stop believing your thoughts all the time. Start being more aware of what's going on. Even in terms of CBT, the form of therapy where you're working on cognition, changing your thought patterns, right? You can't, even with that, you can't do that work without being aware of thinking. If you think you're the thinker of the thoughts, you can't do anything about it. You see, if you're identified with it, you have no space between you and it to deal with it. Do you see that? If you're identified with it, you have no space between you and it to deal with it. You're being it. There's nothing you can do about it. You experience that with anger when the anger calms down, right? And you can't, when it lets go of you, right? And then you realize, oh shit, what was I thinking? What was I doing? And then you feel bad about it. That doesn't do any good, right? That just makes it worse. So this is an important thing to understand about emotions. Emotions is a significant form of human suffering. And the emotional suffering that occurs is a function of conditioning and is a function of the personality. So what I'm saying is that if an anxiety attack comes, right, be aware of it, right? Don't see if you start saying, why am I so anxious? Yeah, right. Yeah, that's not going to make any difference, because you're engaging with the anxiety. You see what I'm saying? You're being anxious about the anxiety, thinking about it. Oh, why am I so anxious, right? Yeah. Yeah, of course. The anxiety is causing you to question, why am I anxious, right? I'm not a psychoanalytic therapist. I don't believe that you have to go back and figure out what happened when you were a kid in order to deal with what you're experiencing right now. All you have to do is be who you really are in relationship to the experience, and the experience will pass. Yeah. All you have to do is understand one thing, one time. It's your conditioning. Understand one thing, one time. That's the only thing you have to understand. It doesn't matter.
For me, it just popped up on the way.
Yeah. I mean, generally speaking, the answer to where it all comes from is your past experiences. What happened when you were a kid? Mostly what happened when you were a kid. Okay. So you get that. You don't have to figure out exactly what specifically happened. that's causing me to be anxious right now. That's a waste of time. Pain is part of being alive. So, there is no solution to pain. Pain is pain, right? But how you relate to pain is another story. If you resist pain, it's a lot, then it's suffering, right? And if you're afraid of pain, then, when pain occurs, see.
So it's the emotions related to the pain.
It's the emotions related to the pain, but it's also allowing the pain to occur. Most people resist, it's like a knee-jerk reaction. Most people have a knee-jerk reaction to pain. They contract against it, right? Or they want to stop it, right? But if you understand what's possible and you're practicing being who you really are, when pain comes, you go to the breath, you focus on relaxing the physical body. You don't try and run from it, you actually look at it, just like emotions. You be aware of the pain, right? If you be aware of the pain will still be painful, right? But it won't be as painful as it was when you were resisting it. Resisting pain causes pain to be more painful. When you relax the physical body, there may be pain, but the pain will be a lot less than it would be if you're contracting against the pain.